welcome to the podcast. So great to have you on. I'm going to jump into a loose introduction and let you fill in some of the gaps, but I'm going to call you a mechanical engineer plus PhD candidate and endurance athlete. I've been researching some of your accomplishments. I mean, they span from kayaking around Lake Superior. It looks like 1,000 miles on the PCT, riding the Tour Divide, placing ninth, and of course the big one, the Colorado Trail race, in which you won last year after an initial year of finishing in second place. How are you doing?
Well, thanks for the introduction. Doing pretty well. Super excited to be on here. I mean, feel pretty lucky to have had the opportunities that I've had, and glad to have been able to chase them down.
And is that how, when somebody asks to introduce yourself, I'm just curious, do you put the endurance athlete first or the academic achievements?
It really depends on who I'm talking to be honest. I usually, don't list my full resume when I first meet somebody. That doesn't seem to go off too well. But yeah, I usually say, oh yeah, like, I think I more start with like the context I'm in. So if I'm like, oh yeah, I'm a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, or well, yeah, I'm the founder of a company. And the bike thing kind of comes last.
The bike thing. I like that the bike thing comes last. Now, how did you get into the outdoors and the endurance sports? Did you grow up doing this?
Yeah, so I mean, it was really basically my entire life, as long as I can remember. My dad has always been super outdoorsy. So he actually did a bike and kayak trip across Canada when he was 29, I think, 30 something. But he did this big trip, and so that's what inspired him. And so when he went and had kids and stuff, he tried to raise us as outdoorsy as possible. I mean, I think when I was 7, I slept. Well, I know when I was 7, I slept an entire summer outside. And so it was like, from that point on, I was just like, always, kind of involved in the outdoors. But really, when I first kind of got into this like ultra endurance, thing, was when we did our kayak trip around Lake Superior. And so that was actually a pretty big deal when it happened. So it was me, my dad, and then my two brothers. One of my brothers was 10, and he was in a tandem with my dad, and the other one of my brothers was 12. And I was 13 at the time. So we set out and we circumnavigated Lake Superior, which is 1,200 miles. It's the world's largest freshwater lake. And it was a really huge accomplishment. And we, by far and away, shattered the record for the youngest people to ever do it. And so that was really what, kind of gave me this like leg up, or understanding that, like, oh yeah, we're, we can do things that pretty much everybody says is like impossible, and mostly nobody understands why you're doing it. But I think that that's really where it started. And then, throughout high school, did a few more trips. We did the Pacific Crest Trail, which 1,000 miles of it. So we started up in Tahoe and hiked, or Truckee, and hiked all the way to the Oregon-Washington border. It was a really amazing trip. And then after that, did the Tour Divide. So, well, first I rode the Tour Divide, and it was a similar situation to you and the CTR, where my dad and brothers and I, we rode this Great Divide mountain bike route, having no idea that there was a race around it. And as we're going through, we're hearing about this race, and we're hearing like, yeah, some people do it in like, 20 days or 17 days or 15 days, whatever. I'm like, no way, that's crazy, because we did it in about 45. And so, of course, then the next year, is actually my younger brother, Luke, who also joined. He was like, I'm going to do the race. And my dad was like, and of course he was 16 at the time. And my dad was like, well, you can't do the whole thing by yourself. Like, you if Will goes for part of it and you guys can split up halfway or something, then we'll let you do it. And so that's how I got into doing it. And then ended up, doing it, finishing 9th place when I was 17, and 17 days. So that was my first introduction to like solo endurance cycling, and then moved on to, actually, it's funny, I've done like all of these big trips, but the thing that I get remembered for the most, at least when I talk to my friends or, other people, is when I was a freshman in college. I went to the University of New Hampshire, and actually biked back from the University of New Hampshire to Wisconsin, where I lived after my freshman year, and so that's what everybody remembers me for. And I'm like, that was like the smallest little like trip that I did, but it just blows people's mind. It's just fucking
I
silly.
like I like that one jumps to everybody's mind. That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's something that we've got in common. Actually, I'm the oldest. I've got two younger brothers as well, so we kind of share that. Now, growing up, and it sounds like that Lake Superior trip really lit a passion and an inspiration, and also kind of demonstrated to you, like proved to yourself that you could do these bigger trips. Is that something that like came out of nowhere, or like it sounds like you had a long history of maybe smaller trips before then, and then somehow decided your dad decided to do this big one?
Yeah, so I think it was, partially inspiration from, my dad. So he did a bike and kayak trip around across Canada. So basically what he did was he started, I think he started on the West Coast. I don't remember actually. But anyways, he biked all the way till he got to Lake Superior, and then he kayaked the north shore of Lake Superior, hopped back on his bike, and then finished going the whole way. So he had done about half of Lake Superior, and that's what his inspiration kind of started from. And then yeah, it was exactly that case of we had done lots of trips to the Boundary Waters, lots of backpacking, smaller stuff, and never anything that big. And the Lake Superior trip was definitely, it was a quite the trip to jump into for the first time, because it's a pretty dangerous like endeavor. And actually, like, yeah, there was somebody that had heard about our trip and went to complete it as well, and like they actually capsized and died on the area that we had gone through. So, and I don't think when I did, I realized like how serious and how cold that water was. But it was a pretty big undertaking that we did at a young
Right.
age. So yeah, I think just growing up with that knowledge of like knowing, wow, that was like actually a crazy thing that we did when we were 13 and 14, I think it's helped a lot for sure.
This is a common theme, and I hope to touch on it at various points through our podcast. Is that you're out there in the wilderness going so hard and doing these amazing kind of achievements, and it seems like from all the articles and the other podcasts you've done that you're a fairly competitive guy, but I want to and successfully competitive guy, but I know from being in some of these environments that they're legitimately dangerous, and I wanted to see how you balance kind of that risk versus reward sort of mentality.
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenging, you know, I guess I don't really know where I stand on that, because it's like, I don't know if I've been lucky the entire time, or if I, developed some skill sets from just being out and doing this stuff so long, that for what's common sense to me, maybe it's not common sense to like somebody else who's like a first timer at doing some of this. So I can't decide really which angle it is, because, maybe I've just been lucky the whole time. But I think that that's a very, a serious thing to understand the risk and understand the real risks. Like, I think when a lot of people think about doing one of these ultra endurance events, whether it's, a big backpacking trip or a big, kayaking, hiking, biking trip, it seems like the number one or number two thing that they're afraid of is like the animals and like the bears and stuff, that they're going to get you. And I'm like, that's, of all the things out there, like that's not it's really like the two biggest things you have to worry about are hypothermia and lightning. I mean, that, like in my mind, and then the third being like, physical injury, that, something like that. But I mean, if you can try to mitigate those as much as possible, and understand that those are your three biggest risks, and I think that like if you're constantly like in the back of your mind saying, okay, like, evaluating yourself, at least for hypothermia, is like, how am I doing, and you have adequate like backup devices, I think you can mitigate those as much as possible. But I think there's still that like inherent risk. But and that's the case in anything you do, right?
I hear you. I hear you. I like that answer, and we're gonna revisit that. But I want to make sure we've put everything in context here in terms of kind of what you just said. So, what is the Tour Divide? And it sounds like the first year you were just riding it for fun, and then the second year you actually joined the race.
Yeah, I mean, as much fun as you can have on the Tour Divide. So the Tour Divide is a 2,753 mile, I believe, mountain bike ride. And it's a route, and it starts up in Banff, Canada, and it goes Banff, Canada, all the way down to Mexico, and it follows the Rocky Mountains, and so it crosses over the Continental Divide 29 or 27 times. I don't exactly remember. But it basically ends up accumulating over 270,000 feet of elevation gain over the course of the ride, which is like going up Mount Everest. What is that? 29 times, something like that, a bunch of times. So it is really, it's a very hilly, very beautiful route that I think transcends some of the most amazing parts of the United States, primarily on like a gravel and like what we call Jeep roads. So it's not like a single track route, which if you're into like mountain biking, bike packing, you know that there's a very difference between riding a gravel road and riding a single track route. And so the Colorado Trail is more of that single track aspect, where the Tour Divide is a lot longer, but it's much more just gravel riding, which is a different animal.
And then at night, are you sleeping in a bivy sack, in a tent, finding a motel? What does that look like?
Yeah. So when we were doing just the ride, um, we were sleeping. We had a tent that we would set up every night, and we would do maybe 40 to 65 miles a day, with our most being 90 miles that we did. So that was, which is, I mean, a significant amount of riding to do in a day, especially on a mountain bike, especially fully loaded. So that we would get in about 4, 5, 6 o'clock, make dinner, camp out. But when you're doing the race, it's almost a completely different ride. It's like there's a lot of the enjoyment just drops out of it, and it's more of about the accomplishment. So instead of riding, you know, 10 hours a day or 8 hours a day, you're riding 16 or 20 hours a day, and then you're never cooking any hot food. You're only eating like granola bars and anything you can just cold food you can grab and go, and sleeping in a bivy sack, or a tent or something. But it's all about efficiency.
Now that's a really interesting description of kind of how it converts over from maybe the ride to the race. And I notice this seems to be a thing that when you go over to these races, it just nobody gets a lot of sleep. You just kind of push yourself deep into the sleepless area. I guess that's just the strategy and what it takes to finish high up.
Mhm.
Right on, right on. Okay, and so moving from the Tour Divide, I think I'm really excited to dig into the CTR, just
Yeah.
because I guess I've done the CT and have that personal experience connection to it. But what is the CTR, and really what does it take to win a race like this?
Uh, yeah. So the CTR is a 531 mile mountain bike race. So it starts in well, either Denver or Durango, Colorado. It flip flops every year, and it basically just does mostly single track, across some very, very technical terrain. And the way I like to put it is just like it's about half of, like, well, 40% pushing your bike and the rest 60% riding your bike. And so it's a very slow, very technical, and very challenging ride. It takes, what would you say it takes the average person to bike it, if they're just touring it?
Well, I hope I come in around the average time. I don't know. It took me 2 weeks to do
Yeah.
it, and I think I was at a leisurely pace, enjoying myself around there. But I know you went sub 5 days, correct?
hmm Yeah. So yeah, right. So to give some perspective, I think 2 weeks is a probably pretty, maybe slightly faster than average, but it's pretty close to the average of how long it takes. So to give you an idea, the 500 miles is much harder than the 2,700 miles, that the Tour divided. So like miles to miles are not something you can be compared. But yeah, the when I raced it, it's much more of a, like, you sleep just as absolutely little as possible, and you bike as hard as you can every second of of the day. So the way that I did my strategy on the most recent one, the one this year that I won, is I basically would sleep in like kind of a 20 to 30 minute chunks. So I did, I think I started at 16 hours and slept like 20 minutes. So anyways, the first day I slept like an hour, and the second day I slept like an hour and 30 minutes, and the third day I slept like an hour and 30 minutes, and then fourth day I slept like 2 hours, and then the last day I slept through my alarm, so I slept 3 hours. um, so that was how I did it. But I mean, in the rest of the time, it was just like you were just grinding. You were either pushing your bike, you were biking, and if you stopped in to get some food, it was like a 5 minute stop. You got back on your bike, grabbed as much food as you could, shoved it in your pockets everywhere, and got back on your bike and went. It was not really, you weren't stopping in restaurants, you weren't, um, doing anything other than just trying to get down the trail as fast as you could.
Now, what is your motivation for competing in an event that is so hard and it seems like pushes everyone, including yourself, right up to your limit and maybe beyond?
That's a great question. I think that in general, this ultra like there's a kind of a people don't understand, or people aren't able to articulate like why you would ever do something like that. I think if more people like understood the like personal value and personal achievement of just finding the like absolute limit of where physically like what you can do, I think that that's really the interest for me. It's like you're like it doesn't really matter that I won the race. It doesn't really matter that I'll finish with this time or whatever, but it's more of like challenging yourself to say, wow, like how hard can I mentally and physically push myself? And I don't really think that there's a better way to find that limit than doing some ultra endurance event, whether that's, 100-mile race, or whether it's a bike packing trip or something like that, where you're saying like, okay, all comfort, everything aside, just going to grind and see what will happen. I think there's some pretty powerful, like, personal transformation that kind of comes out of that. And just like, it gives you a bit of a different perspective on life, because the comfort things that I think we spend a lot of our time worrying about in day to day is something that just kind of goes away, and you're just left with like raw, like, what do I need to survive? And I think it's a good mindset to kind of have moving forward in life. But
I love it. And I think staying on that motivation, and I really like too hearing about the sleep strategy for this thing, because I think it puts everything into perspective. Now, I'm somebody who really likes my 8 hours of sleep a night. Are you somebody who functions well on limited sleep?
so you usually not. Usually I'm a pretty good 8 hour person. Although there recently, I've been kind of pushing it a little bit, because I've been pretty busy with my PhD and stuff like that. But usually I'm always a big fan of the 8 hour a night sleep, and I think that these events they're just different. It's like that you're like for example, the way like it feels like when you're going through the Colorado Trail race is like the first day it's pretty much okay. Around like 1 or 2 a.m. you start to get pretty tired, and I mean at this point too, you've been biking for an incredibly long time, like a longer time than you should ever go biking in your life, but you've been biking for a really long time, so you're starting to get like physically fatigued, and then at that point the mental fatigue starts setting in. But you can usually do like 24 hours. Like I would say that pretty much anybody could do like 24 hours of riding. Now, not necessarily if you could go that fast, but you could, like, if you paced yourself and you could stay up and bike and make forward progress at least for like 24 hours. But after that is when it starts to kind of get more challenging, because if you get through the first day, the sun comes up again, you're all right for a little bit, and then you start to get really tired, and then you start to have to like really actively fight off the sleep demons and the sleep this stuff that happens when you're just that mental state of exhaustion. And as I've shared in other podcasts and stuff, like it gets pretty crazy.
Well, that's an interesting call out. And so for those who don't know, generally speaking, and this is true of the, I believe of the CTR as well, you can watch everybody through a tracking dot, correct? Like kind of track everybody, all the racers' progress. And what I find, just an outsider looking in, is that typically people tend, and you're kind of describing that this same route of people tend to go really hard for the first, I don't know, 24, 48 hours, and they make a ton of progress because they're relatively fresh, moving. And then the back half of the race, it seems like there's a notable slowdown. Maybe it doesn't feel that way in terms of exertion. Um, do you find that this style of racing, you can only go so far? Like you couldn't race like this, I'm assuming, on the Tour Divide, correct?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I was definitely at my limit when I finished the race. And so I think part of the reason why this year was so challenging for me is because I had I had planned it out to do like 4 days or less, like less than 4 days was kind of what I was shooting for. But unfortunately, I got caught with some really bad weather this year and some tough trail conditions um, that that slowed me down, and probably just wasn't as prepared as as perfectly, like not as fit enough or whatever. But anyway, so I was planning on a shorter race, so I was sleeping less in the beginning than I usually would because I was thinking, okay, well, I'm gonna be done in 24 hours more than or less than I was. So that definitely had a big impact on like why it was so physically challenging for me this race.
They always say, right? Everybody has a strategy until they are punched in the face, or no strategy
Yeah.
survives the battlefield. I think there's numerous quotes along those lines. So you mentioned weather. The Colorado Trail has quite a reputation for weather, and it seems like that is a great maybe spoiler in terms of messing with your strategy. Were you, I guess, yeah. So what is the weather situation like on the CT, and how do you adapt to it?
Yeah, so it's very variable. It just depends on the year. Like some years it'll be perfect. It'll be, dry the whole time. But when I did it this year, it rained every single day, and it was like raining, downpouring, freezing cold, like, you know, 30, 40 degrees. And it was tough. And the trail is like when that happens, the trail gets really slippery. It's muddy. Like I had sections that actually like the trail just turned into a river, and I was like, what is this? Um, and it definitely makes it more challenging. You definitely go slower, and it just makes it way less fun. Like when you're battling like the rain pouring down and you're freezing cold, it's like, why am I doing this? Like it just makes it so much harder to keep going through that, and especially because usually with rain comes other dangers like lightning, and that just makes everything more challenging. And you can't like your visibility, especially at nighttime when it's raining, your visibility with your light just is not great. And that's what happened to my light on the third day is my main light went out. So I was just basically riding with a headlight, which is, if you've ever biked with that, it is not fun.
I just, as you talk more and more, I just get this overwhelming sense of grit, and that you're willing to push through all of these different conditions. Now, for context, I guess I would describe, I don't know if the majority of the CT is above tree line, but at least a significant portion is. And I think the average height is around 10,000 feet. Is that roughly in the
Yeah.
ballpark?
Mhm.
So we're talking about a really high altitude trail spanning hundreds of miles, in some pretty serious rain and weather conditions. As a result of that, what kind of gear do you bring to brave these conditions?
Yeah, great question. So I feel like I'm always like always a refining element before you go on every one of these trips. You're like, okay, like I have it perfectly. I remember from last time. Don't do this, and then you get out there and you're like, that was terrible. That was a terrible idea. But to give you an overview of what I brought, so I actually didn't bring a bivy sack or any sleeping arrangement. Because like I said, I was planning on not sleeping much. If I was sleeping, I was just gonna lay on the side of the trail. But I did bring a few rain ponchos, which I highly recommend anybody bring on any sort of large backpacking, bike packing, anything. There's just like cheap $1 plastic rain ponchos. And what you do with those is you put them over your raincoat if you start getting really cold or if it starts raining a lot. And if pretty much every raincoat is like 50% waterproof. I feel like it's like it rains for an hour and then you're soaked. But if you have one of those things over the top, it'll keep you dry, it'll keep you warm. So that's actually a huge safety feature that I feel like everybody should know about because it's not really talked about much. And you do look a little goofy wearing a plastic rain poncho. But as soon as you get over that, I think it's a great factor.
I've heard you talk about that before, and that's a really interesting, like, kind of like insider tip. Do you find that you get wet from like sweating, like the lack of breathability when you wear up like that sort of poncho setup?
It really depends on the temperature. So for me, it's like that's kind of one of the last resort. Like if I have my down jacket on and I have a raincoat on, I like that's my rule. It's like I have to have that poncho on because my down jacket is like I need to keep that as dry as possible. And if I'm cold enough to be wearing that down jacket, then I absolutely need to have, that extra layer of protection. And it does a lot to keep you warm. But I think that like for me at least, you this is an area that you really kind of have to be conscious about when you're planning, like how you're what gear you have, what's the state of the gear that you have as well. Because one of the things that I really try hard is to keep all of my gear dry, or at least keep the life-saving gear dry. And if that gear starts to get wet, like you have to realize that you need to stop and you need to dry that out, because if you get a wet down jacket and it starts raining harder or snowing or whatever, you're in for hypothermia. So I think that like that's another a really important part of this is just taking like general overview of like, okay, how's my gear doing? How is, my body and my mind doing from an objective perspective? And I think that gets really hard when you start pushing yourself to like physical limits and mental limits. But I think that that's probably one area where I can be like, okay, well, how is my gear? How is my headspace? How is my body? Like, can I keep going? And I think that I spend a lot of time on these ultra endurance events, just asking myself, okay, like, can I physically keep going? And is it safe to keep going? And if the answer is yes to both of those, then I, keep going. And I guess safe is kind of a subjective term and something that you have to learn from experience. But yeah, that's where I find myself at least a lot.
That's No, that's a really interesting perspective, and I always tell people, like, you can be wet or you can be cold, but you can't be both. I think you certainly push are at the far edges of that, but it's interesting. It's really interesting to hear your perspective. Now, you glossed over it super quick, but I do want to call that out, is that it sounds like for the 2022 race, you brought no sleep system whatsoever. So no sleeping bag, no tent, no bivy sack, and not even a tarp over the top of yourself. And that's just for speed and weight, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And looking back on it, probably wouldn't do it again. um, yeah, maybe for the Arizona Trail, like the Arizona Trail 300, I would do it that way, because I think that that's just like you basically bike straight to the night. You don't really stop. But for this one, I think I would bring some sort of bivy sack. And the reason for that, so I mean, I kind of go back and forth, because it was, like a bivy sack is a really good safety. It's a really okay safety measure. It's like if you're planning on sleeping, it's nice to have one, but like I just am always afraid to be like huddle up on the side of the road, all my clothes are wet in my bivy sack, thinking it's going to save me. I just don't think that's the case. Like if you're in the situation where you're going to like a bivy sack as like a last resort, like you should call the hit your spot beacon, because like getting in a bivy sack is just not going to warm you up that much. So I think it really depends on your strategy. I think for 99% of people, they should have some sort of sleeping arrangement when they do one of these races. It's not a ideal thing. But basically what I did was I didn't take a sleeping bag. I didn't take a raincoat. But I did take extra like warm layers. So I feel like I had around the same like insulative warmth that I would have with both of those things. I just didn't have like the comfortable setup to lay down and do that. So,
I hear you. That's interesting. I think as you are doing, as I do, as I think everybody does, after you do one of these bigger races, or in my case, events, you always go back through and think like, how would I change the gear and whatnot. And I actually brought a bivy sack on mine, and I really wish I would have just brought the tent. Just having that extra space, because these storms in the Colorado mountains are ferocious, is how I would depict them. So they're not fun. I'm sure they're not fun to ride through, and they're certainly not fun to ride out in a bivy sack.
hmm Yeah,
Now, oh, go
absolutely.
ahead.
Y- Yeah, well, I was just gonna say that like I I think that for the Colorado Trail, if you're just riding, I would go with the tent. It's like, or if you're doing a bivy sack, you have to have a tarp as well, just because otherwise, like it's you will spend hours just laying in your bivy sack, just covered up, and just waiting for that to end. That's at least what I feel like.
Right, right. That is a very salient picture to have in your mind when you're making gear
Yeah,
choices here. Now
yeah.
I read in my notes. I didn't write down if this is the 21 or 22 race, but
It
now
is.
since we're on the topic of weather, it sounds like you sort of ended up in a situation by luck of the dice roll where you missed a lot of weather in the early races in the early stage. Was that in the 2022 race?
That was in the 2021 race, and so yeah, I got
Okay.
I got pretty lucky there because so there was a well, yeah, basically what happened is there was a big storm that came in and hit around when people were either getting to Silverton or like riding right out of Silverton. And so I was fortunate enough that I was able to hide out in the Mullis campground background or bathroom. So I just sat in a bathroom for like an hour and a half while everybody else got dumped on, and then I went out after it stopped raining. So I missed the big rain, which I think is super crucial to like your mental standpoint of I didn't get freezing cold, didn't almost get struck by lightning. I was just chilling in the bathroom eating some snacks and, and drinking water. Um, so, but I think that one was really lucky. And the second race, I did not get that lucky. The
Okay.
2022, it was like, nope, there's none of that. It was raining every day.
Well, now, so talking speaking about that 2021, was that planned on your part, or was that just complete luck that you missed the weather?
So it was a little bit of both. I mean, I could see it coming, and that while it's always tempting, especially that early in the race, to like try to make up miles and try to make ground. I kind of knew. I was like, I kind of had that feeling. I was like, you know what, if I don't sit this out, it's gonna be tough. And so I was like, all right, I'm just gonna sit it out for a few minutes, and if nothing happens, then I'll hop back out. I'm really glad I did because it saved me. And then basically what happened in that is everybody who was out in the rain, um, oh, I think we dropped out. You
Oh,
back there? It seems like the audio cut out for a second.
I think it dropped. Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Do you mind
gotcha.
picking that up from the start of the conversation, start of the question and Q&A?
Sure. Um, yeah. So basically what happened in 2021 was everybody except for me and I think um, the leader. The leader was in Silverton when it started raining, but basically most people got caught in this big thunder, rain, hail, whatever. They got caught in this big storm and they got really cold and they got really shook up. And so they went and they all stopped in Silverton and they spent the night there. But I, on the other hand, didn't get caught in that because I was hiding out in a bathroom. So I was like, I was still feeling fine. Nothing of mine was wet. So then I just kept going while it was drizzling, and I ended up stopping in Silverton and then kept going through the night. So it was the two of us that kept pushing through that first night, and we ended up getting first and second. But people did catch up a little bit. So it was like, I was racing and uh, I slept that night for like 3 hours and then people caught up. But I had the advantage of they slept from like 10 to 12 and I slept from like 3 to 5. And so that just that difference in when you slept meant that like I was much more rested going into the day than they were because they had been biking for, basically 3, 4 more hours than I was, or 4 or 5 more hours. So that definitely helped as I went forward, just like mentality.
That's interesting. When you were kind of like hanging out, waiting to see if the storm was going to come or not, I mean, did you feel a lot of pressure to continue, or were you like, no, it's the right call to stop here?
At that point, I was so tired. I was just like,
Okay.
so one of the hardest parts was eating in that first year of doing it. Like people don't realize is when you start, everyone thinks like, oh my gosh, I'd be so hungry when I, basically bike for 13 hours. But really, it's hard to eat, especially when it's hot out. You just like everything your body just kind of rejects because you're on this flight or fight or flight mode. And so you really have to force yourself to eat. And so for me, I was just like, my blood sugar was just so low. Like I was just absolutely in bonk mode that I was like, I just need to stop. And I know I need to make myself eat. And I'm just going to sit here until I can and eat something and drink something. So for me, it was a pretty easy call.
Now, speaking of food, you also mentioned that you do cold food on these races. So, what does eating look like? What kind of food do you bring? And it sounds like you're not stopping to have a meal.
Yeah, honestly, I'm still trying to figure out the food thing. To like that's still one of the biggest challenges. One of the things that I do like a lot is Tailwind Nutrition. Are you familiar with that?
I don't know that.
Okay, well they're based out of Durango, Colorado, so they're very local, but they make this really high calorie like drink mix. So it's like 240 calories or whatever for like a little packet. And so if you just add that to water, it's really easy to get down. And they also have a bunch of stuff that has electrolytes, and a bunch of different stuff. But it's usually like you can usually drink more than you're able to eat out there. So that's a good thing. But on the flip side, what I've done a lot in the past is I'll bring a lot of just like candy bars, granola bars, honey buns, whatever you can buy at a gas station. Because you got to remember that like you're not stopping at like high, perfect nutrition. You don't have somebody handing you like bananas along the way. You're stopping in gas stations, and it's like whatever high calorie food you can get. But as I went through the Colorado trail race and I went on to the Arizona trail race this year, I started to find that like the really high sugary stuff has some definite problems. Like when you're eating food, like it starts to do damage to like your mouth. And I know this might like be a little nasty for some people, but basically like when you just eat sugar straight and you're like mouth freezing for a few days straight, your mouth's like your taste buds start to die off, and they're like you start to get like these sores in your mouth, and it's probably one of the most painful things ever. It's like I it's like pouring like, let's say you had a cut on your tongue and then you just like drank vinegar. That's what I can equate it to. And so that's where these like really high sugar diets, you know, end up getting you in trouble. Is like day 3, day 4 of just doing this and not sleeping much. You put so much stress on your body, and I think you have such a dry mouth that like when I got back, like you could see like half of my tongue, my taste buds were just gone, and it was so painful. So, anyways, that makes you want to eat less. So the only things you can eat are like things that do not have a lot of sugar, so very bland food. So I found the eggs were really good. So I would just go into a gas station and buy like 6 or 8 hard-boiled eggs, and I would just eat them. And then it was a great source of like level energy protein. Because I think what happens is when you're just eating like the sugary food, is you get these big spikes of like you eat it and like, oh, you feel great, and then you just crash. But if you eat something that's a little more substantial, like if you can find a burrito, you can find like uh, an egg or something like that, it'll you don't feel as good right after, but it's more of a levelized energy source, which I'm sure we know from science all the time, but it's kind of like trying to apply that on the fly. That's always a challenge.
You're really selling this adventure here, the way you describe it. Uh, and then as far as the food goes, how much food initially are you bringing? Is it enough for a day and a half before you have to kind of resort to this gas station, anything goes kind of world?
Yeah, it really depends on the race that you're doing and where your resupply points are. So for me, I actually brought too much food in the beginning because I was thinking like, I was planning on 2 days resupplying and then 2 days again, but that wasn't the case because like I started eating my food and I realized that I hated all my food, which is like the case of anyone who's ever done any one of these trips. They're like, they start eating the food, like, wow, why did I pack any of this? This is a terrible idea. So then you go to a gas station, then you buy a bunch of other stuff. So I packed too much of the wrong food, but I planned for 2 days at least.
Gotcha. Now, and to you briefly mentioned, man, I don't know what else to call it rather than like, and I'm talking about the back to this like sleep deprivation, calorie deprivation, late night hiking, late night riding. You get into a more or less like a, I don't know, I would describe it as a hallucinatory state. Is that a good way to
Yeah.
describe that?
Yeah, I think so. So there's kind of like a few different stages of like sleep deprivation. I feel like and if you, I also have a blog that goes over my whole race in a lot of detail as well. So if you go to my website, willbodewes.com, it has probably a better description than what I can do on the spot here. So yeah, if you're curious to read that, I detail all the sleep stages. But I say that there's like 5 different stages of sleep deprivation. So like the first one is like you go for 24 hours without sleep, and I think most people have been there where you just like you're really tired. You kind of like you nod off as soon as there's like not any stimulation to you. So you're sitting in a chair, whatever, trying to read a book, you'll nod off and you'll fall asleep. So that's kind of like that's stage one. I think pretty much everyone's has been there. And then stage two is like, you've kind of gone for 2 days with very minimal sleep, and also you have to think about adding in this, physical exertion piece of it as well. And so phase two is like when you really start to fall asleep when you're like riding a bicycle, or like going down a hill. You have to like, you start like doing this thing where you like, you shake your head and like try to wake yourself up, and like you even start like blurting out like random little blurbs of like conversation, like, hey, like wake up, like stuff like that. But then stage 3 to 5 are when things like really start getting interesting. So like stage 3 is like, kind of like day 3, or you get to a point where you're really sort of tired, and it's like you find yourself just like involuntarily like talking, like you'll kind of like be riding along, and usually it's like 2 a.m. or something, and you'll just be like, you'll like blurt out some random piece of information that like it's almost like kind of like your subconscious is like you're dreaming, and then you just start talking, and then you realize, and what the heck was that? Like I was like talking about like a fishing pole in the middle of my race, and I was like, that makes no sense. Um, so that's stage 3, and then, which is fine. I mean, I think people can get there, and they're, you're just a little confused, you're a little bit out of it, and you kind of look like a zombie. And then stage 4 is when, things start to get pretty weird. That's when you like start hallucinating. So you'll look over at like a bush, and you'll think like, oh, that's like a bear, or like you'll see something, and you'll be like, oh, you think like that post is a witch, which like this doesn't make any sense. Like, why would a post be a witch? But like in your brain, like, oh yeah, that's just a witch over there, And then stage 5 is like where like that's where things kind of get scary, because you get like super paranoid about like falling asleep, but you get really, really frustrated about not being asleep. It's just like this weird, it's just like almost like you're having a nightmare while you're awake. Is the best way that I can put it. Whereas like stage 4 was like you're having a dream, and your subconscious is like coming in, you're kind of like loopy, and you're really trying to keep yourself awake. But stage 5 is like you're just angry that you're awake, but you're too paranoid to sleep. And it's a really kind of weird state that happens after just a long time of just like pushing yourself. And eventually, like, some event will happen, and you'll kind of move out of that state. So like the sun will come up, or you'll have a little food, and you have that, and you'll get out of there. But it's very frustrating. You're just like I found myself just like yelling at at the world, just feel like, like why do I feel like this? Stage 5 is somewhere I suggest that nobody ever gets to, like, because you're so confused, and you're just so angry at like being awake, and it's not fun.
But that is quite the journey arc that you're taking us through here. Now, do you find that wow, there's a couple different ways, there's a couple different things that I'm thinking of here. Now, do you find that throughout it all, your mind is staying focused on the race and trying to complete it and trying to finish at a high spot? Or do you find as well that you, I don't know, think about life, or like business ideas or academic ideas? Where does your mind go as you go through this sleep deprivation?
So I really think it depends on what kind of race or ride you're doing. Like I think a ride or a trip is a nice time to like, meditatively think about different ideas and sort through, if issues that you're having with your own life. But I think the race, it's, for me at least, it's very focused on the race. Like I think I spend a lot of time thinking about where I am, where I'm going. And it's almost like, I think I'm a competitive person. So I'm very much focused on finishing the race, getting to this next point, and just, that's where 100% of my focus is on.
Now, you're describing these these really rather extreme hardships that you're overcoming here: sleep deprivation, cold, wind and rain. Have you ever been to a point where you've quit a race, or you've thought about quitting or abandoning?
Well, I think I've thought about quitting every single race I've done. I mean,
Okay.
like that's what I feel like. If you're not thinking about quitting, it's not hard enough. It's at some point. Now you have to keep in mind, like, if it's a safety thing, then that's different. But if it's like, this is just really hard and I want to quit, then you're on the right track. Because I think that's like, that's where you want to be in order to like, to really like, because once you've like overcome that, it's like a personal challenge that you've overcome, and you're like, you have this perspective of like, oh yeah, like I can do like these crazy hard things. And I think that's, if you get to that point, like, I want to keep going. But if you get to the point where you're like, I want to quit because this isn't safe, like, that's when you should absolutely quit. But I did ended up dropping out of the Arizona Trail race this year, which I was really bummed about, because so the Arizona Trail race, I way better in terms of my experience than the Colorado Trail race. It was, so if you don't know, it's Arizona. It's a 300-mile or a 750-mile race, but I did the 300-mile one just from time constraints. But it's a 300-mile race. It starts on the Mexico border, goes up Arizona. It's actually really slow and hike-a-bikey. So it's, I would say, like 50% pushing your bike, and very slow, even compared to the Colorado Trail. So I was doing that, and I was kind of going back and forth with this another racer. So between first and second, we had a pretty good lead on everybody else. And unfortunately, I had a few mechanical issues that had to drop out of the race. So first thing that happened was I lost my rear brake. So I only had a front brake, and I did that for like, I don't know, 6 or 7 hours, just
Oh
riding with
no.
only a front brake, which is not as fun as it sounds. But I was able to keep going through that until I could get to a. You still there?
Oh, there you go. You're back. You lost your rear brake.
Okay. Yeah, so I lost my rear brake, so I only had a front brake. So I was constantly like almost going over the handlebars, and I went over the handlebars a few times, just because a front brake is not as useful as, having that rear one. But fortunately, I was able to get something replaced after like 6 or 7 hours of riding like that, which is pretty brutal. But I was able to keep going, and then unfortunately, what happened was I got punctured my tube, and broke a spoke, punctured my tube. My wheel was all out of whack, and then had a tubeless tire, and I put a tube in, but unfortunately it had like 15 flats width on that between my two tubes, and I was like, well, this is pointless anymore, so I had to drop out. But that was the only one, and I feel, and I was like, I was not at all upset about that, because I said, well, I literally tried everything that I could have done. I should have prepared better, but there's nothing I can do at this point moving forward, so I'm fine with like dropping out of the
Well,
race.
it's interesting there, describing your Arizona experience, is that you had multiple mechanical problems. It sounds like by and large that has not been an issue prior to this.
Yeah, it kind of depends. Like, you have mechanical, like, I've had mechanical issues on every ride that I've done. Some of them are just trip ending, and some of them are not. Like, if your tire doesn't work, like, that's trip ended. But like in the Colorado Trail, I did end up breaking a chain this year, and then I was having some pretty big issues with like my shifting, so it wouldn't go into. I only had like 3 or 4 gears for a while until I figured out that my limit screw was just unscrewed, and because I kept adjusting, and it wouldn't work, and I finally fixed it about halfway. And then the first one I lost a cleat on my pedal. That was a big pain. So I was riding with one cleat, and yeah, that was tough.
Wow.
So I mean,
Wow.
but yeah, I mean, you kind of always have, like, that's what at least for me, and I don't have, the crazy expensive bike with perfect gear or anything. So I'm always kind of making do with what I have, but there's going to be mechanical issues, and it's just trying your best to prepare for how to fix them.
I do like, though, there is a general theme that seems to run through, whether it be, weather, strategy, food, mechanicals, is that you kind of have this attitude of just pushing through and being able to figure out it out as best as you can.
Uh-huh.
Now, It's interesting to hear you talk about Arizona as well, and kind of reading some of your Colorado Trail experience. How often are you riding with other people? From your descriptions, it seems like you're solo the overwhelming majority of the time.
hmm So yeah, it pretty much you are solo for the other time for most of the time. But what happens is, if you're riding, like I was riding pretty close to this, like in terms of we were riding around the same pace. So what would happen is he would stop somewhere, I would catch up to him, I would pass him, and and then I would stop, and then he would pass me. So that's kind of where you're riding. You're not really like you'll ride to get like usually at the start of the race, people will ride together for the first like 15, 20 miles. And then at that point, there's been enough separation where you break apart and you're kind of going by yourself. But you'll bump into racers along the way. So you'll see a racer and be like, "Oh, I just passed this guy." Like, you know. But for the most part,
Well,
you're solo.
well, that's an interesting point because I know that you're very much part of the community, and kind of know the fellow riders and fellow racers, and are they're probably part of your friend group. But
Yeah.
are you excited to see somebody else on the trail, or is it very much like you want to be out in front?
Usually, if I see someone on the trail, I'm excited because that means I'm passing them, unless they're catching me. But I mean, don't get me wrong. It's like you're all like you're very like at least I am friendly, and most other riders are friendly. When you see somebody else, like if somebody catches up to you, usually you ride with them for like 10, 15 minutes. Like, hey, how's it going? And just have a short conversation. But like at least in my head, it's like a very competitive. Like, oh, shoot, you just caught me. Like, I have to got to plan this out better. I gotta, this is how I'm gonna beat him. Like, because for me, I think that's what keeps me going. It's the competitive aspect. It's like, yeah. And I think, I would be curious to do an individual time trial of one of these rides because I think that aspect would really drop out. And I'd be curious to see if, I was able to be even close to my time. Or maybe it'd be better because I would just make smarter decisions rather than getting all caught up in the race.
Right, right, right. Absolutely. Now, in terms of your fitness coming into these races, how much training are you doing, and are you on the bike a lot?
So probably not as much as I should have been. I had a wrist issue on before the Colorado Trail, so I'd only ridden like my longest ride was like 16 miles before the Colorado Trail this year, which was not recommended for anybody. Um, so I had only ridden a mountain. I'd done a bit of road riding and I'd done a lot of running and endurance, and that's I think where I fortunately have a big base because I skied Division 1 for University of New Hampshire, so I have a really big endurance base that I think I take for granted a lot, but it really helps me on these races. And then I think also just like doing this stuff growing up, like you don't realize how that like doing a 2,700-mile race when you're 16 and 17, like that stuff still kind of is with you in some ways. And I think the attitude of how to go about something like that is there for sure. So probably not as much as I should be on the bike, and in a perfect world I would be, but I was very busy with my company at that point. So
Well, that's one of the, I think, more inspiring aspects of hearing you talk and describe kind of your training regimen, because I know everybody is really busy, and we're all trying to make time to go out to the trail and kind of do these adventures. But in a way, it's interesting that it sounds like you're an advocate that if you have the time to carve out an hour a day to run or hike or do anything cardiovascular, that translates, it sounds like, pretty significantly to the trail.
no, yeah, absolutely. And I'm a big fan of like running in general, just because I think it's a really quick way to get good cardiovascular fitness. If it's not giving you issues with your knees or whatever, then I think 100%. And bike when you can, do rides when you can, but it just takes longer to get that same level of like breathing hard and like, man, that was a good workout. So that's what I do a lot.
Well, I'm going to take that to heart, coming from somebody who is busy trying to start my own company, and I'm doing
hmm
the Belgian waffle ride later this year in 2 months, and really am sorely under equipped to even complete it right now. So I'm gonna try to run more, find the time to do that. Now, I want to make sure we've got enough time to talk a little bit about your company.
Sure.
Coming out of undergrad, were you just inspired to be an entrepreneur, and what was kind of the motivation to create this?
Yeah, so I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur. I mean, that was like, I never really knew what that was like, but I always wanted to be an entrepreneur, and I just felt that I had a few ideas that I was working with in college, and so the way that it kind of worked is I had, I always have this giant list of ideas that I have, and I said, okay, well, this is the time. I graduated college. I'd like to try one of these out. Um, and so, I was working a little bit on my PhD, but I also was like, I'm going to try to start this company while I'm doing this, and see what happens. And so I ended up applying to this accelerator program called SCAPE. It's a Southwest Colorado accelerator program. It's just very last minute. I started a company, made the LLC, went through all that stuff and applied to them. And this is an accelerator program that accepted my company in, and they trained me for 6 months and showed me how to start a business and introduced me to a lot of connections, and basically went a long ways in terms of giving me a lot of knowledge and background. So I guess I should introduce what my company is at this point. So I run a company called Spoke Sound. So what we've done is we build Bluetooth speakers and do canvas photographs. So basically, what that means is like it looks just like a canvas photograph, but we've built a Bluetooth speaker in. So we work with a lot of artists, a lot of photographers, but we also do like customized images. So you can go to our website and upload any photo you want, and we kind of help you create like an audio-visual experience. And yeah, like we also, if you're a photographer or an artist or something like that, and you're looking at like for a different way to sell your work, absolutely, reach out to us because we're always looking for artists to partner with, as well. And so basically my motivation behind, why I wanted to create this is, I thought that, like, first of all, I thought the technology that we're using it's fundamentally different from other speaker technologies. So I think it's pretty cool. But secondly, it was just like, I like the idea of, creating something that's aesthetically, and artistically like pleasing. And this was a cool way to allow people to kind of customize their audio experience and, and do all of that. And it was an incredibly difficult challenge. I think, in some aspects harder than the Colorado Trail race to go through figuring out like all the technical and also the like mental challenge of going and starting your own business. As I'm sure it's like it's a very, very hard thing to do, to leave like a stable position and go out and do that. So hats off to anybody who's done it, because like I said, I think it's hardest doing the Colorado Trail race.
Well, it's certainly an adventure in its own right, as I'm
Yeah.
finding out, and I definitely agree with you. Leaving the stability is
Right.
definitely a walk into the abyss, or a walk into the unknown. Now, it sounds like you kind of in having this idea and recognizing this problem, right? I think I've read on your website, it's based off the premise of trying to make an aesthetically pleasing speaker is kind of the
Mhm.
core impetus, the core problem. Given that,
Mhm.
I guess the current state of speakers are that they are not necessarily the most visually pleasing.
Mhm. Yeah, essentially, and like there's a few kind of general problems with speakers. Is like, for example, like take like your kitchen, like they're a lot of times just like cluttering up space on your countertop, or they're like hidden away in drawers. And so it's really nice to have something that's like hanging on your wall, like playing music at ear level without like need of stands. And so that's the nice thing, is our speakers just hang on the wall and they're always there, just waiting for you to just turn them on and play music. So.
Right on. Did you like custom design, given your engineering background,
Mhm.
the speaker that kind of, it sounds like, integrates in the canvas itself?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So designed everything, pretty much everything from it. We use some off the shelf like electronics, but we developed I've developed circuit boards and speaker components and frame and pretty much everything from that to the manufacturing process. And so right now we have a company that does the order fulfillment for us. So we still make all of the frames and stuff in Durango, and then we ship them out to another company that is their canvas wrapping. They got like 30 printers or something, so they wrap all of our speakers and they send it out. So that's allowed me a little bit more flexibility to kind of, like I said, go back and chase down this other passion of mine, which is artificial intelligence, and this PhD that I'm working on right now, but at the same time, working on a company and doing that other lens of entrepreneurship that I'm also really passionate about. So
You definitely have a lot of coals in the fire, as the
yeah.
saying goes. Now,
Yeah.
what was the hardest part about starting your company?
I think the hardest part was there's just like so much that you don't know and that you know you don't know. So especially like not coming from a business background or anything like that. I think it's just like it's a very big challenge to uh, like all this. There's like all these like big challenges that you just have no idea about, and I think it's also very hard for me at least to have looked at my friends and colleagues and stuff go and work and make significantly more money than you, and you're out there chasing this idea that you don't know if people are going to want, and you don't know what's going to happen with it, and you're looking for funding, you have no idea if you're going to get it, and it's just like there's a lot of these questions that you're just like sitting there scratching your head, and you're watching other people like get a stable job and um you know enjoy what they're doing. I think that's got to be one of the hardest part um about this whole process.
Sure. That uncertainty aspect. Now, are you finding?
Mhm.
And I guess all my questions come from my original degree was financial economics, so definitely coming from a real business mindset. Are you
Mhm.
finding that you're having most success partnering with artists to do kind of preset designs, or are you also doing custom designs where you let customers choose their design as well?
hmm Yeah, so it really depends on the time of year. So like around the holidays, we'll get a lot of, or Valentine's Day and stuff like that. We'll get a lot of custom orders. So people will upload their own photo because it's a very unique gift, and I think that that's where that fits in nicely. But in terms of like, artists get excited about it because it allows them to create like an audio visual experience. And so if they're like selling at booths and stuff like that, or even if they're selling online, we allow them to put like a little QR code on the side so people can scan that song that they want and then play the music that the artist had put in mind. But it's a Bluetooth speaker, so you can play whatever you want. So I think probably our better channel is partnering with artists, and we're looking into like hotels and other areas in which kind of like bespoke audio is important. But yeah, that's right now where we're biggest.
That's an interesting idea, though. Hotels, I really like corporate headquarters. I know we're in a new world, like post pandemic, or as like so the work from home is still kind of a thing, but I feel like
Right.
there's a location for that. I don't know, who knows coffee shops. I could uh
hmm
I could riff all day with you. Now, I let me ask this. What are your ambitions for this year, 2023? Are you thinking about riding the CTR again, or where's your head with that?
So I don't know about the CTR. I did like to go back into the Arizona Trail Race. So
Okay.
regardless if I do, because it would also complete my Triple Crown, which if you don't know, Triple Crown is doing the Tour Divide, the Colorado Trail Race, and the Arizona Trail Race. Um, so I'd love to complete that Triple Crown. So I'm really thinking about doing that this year. We'll see if I can get the time and logisticals because the Arizona Trail Race takes about 7 to 8 days, depending. Um, so that would be the ideal. I don't think I'm gonna do the Colorado Trail Race this year just because uh, I feel like I've had two really solid efforts. I think I need to take some time off and just breathe for a second on that one and let some other people uh, put up some crazy times.
Sure, carry the mantle. And now, are there other like other big outdoor or racing objectives that are in the wheelhouse that maybe not this year, but one day you'd like to take a swing at?
Um, I think I want to do an Ironman. I've been thinking about it in the next few months or something like that, just because I feel like I at this point I should, like more of a check it off the bucket list. Because everyone's always like, "You know, an Ironman?" I'm like, "No." I'm like, "I know I could do Ironman." So I feel like I should just get that one done so I can say yes to that question for, and also I think it's a fun event and there's a lot of support for it. Um, but yeah, in terms of like other big races, like I said, I don't think it's like my number one focus right now. I think that some people are like, that's their sport and they're, ultra endurance racer. I don't think that that's my thing. It's a passion of mine that I like to work in tandem with. And I think it helps me like by working out and by doing these things, it helps me, um, you know, make myself a lot more focused in general life, and also just have this opportunity to like push myself and really like uh, just overcome a lot of challenges.
Awesome. Awesome. No, it's interesting to hear just like how many, like I said, how many coals you've got in the fire, and hearing all the different motivations and all that. Will, it was excellent. It was excellent having you on the podcast. Thanks for joining and running us through both your entrepreneurial passions as well as your outdoor and kind of race goals. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely, and I really appreciate you having me, and I hope some of your audience can find some value in this, and get out there and go for it if you've got a desire to do something like that. That's what I'd recommend.